Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, we dig into what's roiling the world of big science. In the second half of our show, we'll be joined by Daniel Sarowitz, professor of science and society at Arizona State University and co-director of the Consortium for Science, Policy, and Outcomes. Dan's recent thought piece, Saving Science, the New Atlantis, set off a firestorm of ivory tower introspection when he challenged the sacred narrative of academic science. Up first, we're pleased to welcome Jeremy Berg, the new editor-in-chief of the Science Journals and professor of computational and systems biology at the University of Pittsburgh. Jeremy, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Jeremy, I asked you on because you recently sounded the alarm that the public is losing faith in scientific authority and is beginning to see scientists as just another special interest group. I mean, this has profound implications, not only on the willingness of taxpayers to fund research, but on the way science is used to inform public policy and the way public policy is used to direct the course of science. Let's start at the top. If you add it all up, including the NIH, the NSF, DOE, DARPA, and the other federal agencies, how much public money is spent on science research?
Well, I'm most familiar with the NIH and NSF. I think the combination is probably in the vicinity of $50 billion a year.
So we're talking about serious money here.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and a lot of responsibility that goes with it. You know, I'm from the private sector. If a private company, say a pharmaceutical firm or a high-tech startup, invests its research dollars poorly, it goes out of business. How does the public know whether it's getting its money's worth from the funding of basic scientific research?
Well, let me start with one important aspect of that, and that the federal support for science is balanced by a comparable level of investment in research and development from the private sector. They really complement each other in the sense that the federal programs tend to support more fundamental research, sometimes called basic research, that underpins a lot of investments and developments in the private sector, so that the sorts of things that the federal government primarily invests in is research that doesn't really have a short-term return on investment, would be very hard for the private sector to do. On the other hand, if you take it away, then the private sector doesn't really have the necessary basic knowledge that they need to commercialize and develop products and services for the benefit of the country and the world. And, the question of spending money wisely, I think, is an incredibly important one. The best way that I know of to do that is to try to be transparent about what sorts of research the federal government invests in and what the benefits of it are, what the outcomes, both short-term and long-term of those investments are. I think that's something where progress has been made, but it's challenging to be transparent, particularly when you're talking about as you can imagine, with a $40 or $50 billion portfolio in different agencies. There are a huge number of projects, and you really need to look at the whole package to understand it. I think one thing which tends to happen is that a single project or a small number of projects get singled out as, particularly as sounding silly, even if they aren't silly, and that, I think, doesn't serve the public well to really understand what their money is being spent on.
To help us with understanding the process, how are federal grants doled out for scientific research? Who gets the money and who doesn't?
Well, the basic process for most of the money is that individual investigators or small teams of investigators write an application that describes what they think is an important problem and how they propose to address it. And these are submitted to the agencies, and then they're subjected to peer review. That is, outside scientists are sent their proposals. They review them for their scientific merit, the importance of the problem. They provide input back to the agencies, and then scientists within the agencies eventually make funding decisions about what gets funded and what doesn't.
So, Jeremy, what role does scientific publishing play in who gets research grants, particularly the prestige publications like Science and Nature?
So that's a good question. I think there are a small number of journals, and I think Science and Nature are at the top of those, where the level of prestige is very high, and having a publication in one of those, or having publications in one of those journals, can be very important to developing and continuing to develop a scientific career. I think it's gotten a little bit too much that way. Even as the editor of Science, I think there's lots of terrific science that isn't published in these top, highest impact journals because they're too specialized, or just because of the number of papers that these journals can publish that end up in other journals, which are very important. And I think the whole field is struggling a little bit with, to be fair, I think a little bit of laziness of using publication in Science and Nature as a shorthand for high-quality science, when in fact it's spread much more widely than that.
What's a journal impact factor, and how is that used or misused?
So journal impact factor is something that was developed really for librarians who are trying to decide, if they have a budget, which journals they should buy subscriptions to and which they shouldn't. So it's a single number that measures the average number of citations for papers that have been published recently in a journal. So it's a reasonable metric. It's got some flaws, but it's a reasonable metric for librarians or for journal editors to try to decide how their journal is doing compared to other journals. The problem is it's like a Nielsen rating. Well, it's been used like that. It's in some ways it is like a Nielsen rating, except the problem is that the biggest abuse is when it's used to judge an individual paper. So it's a little bit like, to use your analogy, it's a little bit like deciding the quality of a show based on the overall Nielsen distribution at CBS or NBC or your network, when in fact what you really want to look at is that show. So it's perfectly reasonable to judge a paper by saying how many times has this been cited over the last few years or over its lifetime. But to do it by just saying, well, it was published in this journal, which tends to have highly cited papers, and therefore it must be a good paper, is really flawed and lazy. Looking at this process, particularly peer review, many critics point out that the bulk of federal science funding goes to older, senior principal investigators, generally pursuing low-risk research. Are we shortchanging our young scientists who might have game-changing ideas but have to be broken to the plow first, serving for years on the postdoc plantation? I think that's something which, certainly from my time, I should say I spent 8 years directing the National Institute of General Medical Sciences at NIH. And from my time there, I think the challenge of how to recognize the research contributions of younger investigators is a hard problem, but I think some steps are being taken and probably more need to be taken. The challenge is comparing applications from seasoned, well-established investigators who are both have established research programs and also are very good at writing compelling grant proposals, compared with younger scientists who are just getting started, who don't have the track record. My sense is that the best way to do it is to have explicit programs or aspects of the review process that recognize career stage in evaluating proposals. So when I was at NIH, I coined a term which was innovation density. That is, as a way of explicitly saying this person may be only 35 years old, but they've been very innovative and very productive given their career stage, and therefore you should look at that rather than looking at, their total number of publications or how much they've accomplished, because if you're comparing a 35-year-old or a 40-year-old with a 60-year-old, it's not surprising that the 60-year-old has more accomplishments because they've had a longer time to accrue those. So one of the programs which was started when I was at NIH, when I was primarily responsible for what's called the NIH Director's New Innovator Award Program, which is explicitly for people within 10 years of their doctorate, MD or PhD, and provides 5 years of support with a relatively short application that allows people to really go forth and propose the most exciting, innovative thing they can think of and then compete just among, their peers for funding. And that program, I think, has been quite successful in getting people's careers off to a good start, and it's also been very, very satisfying. When I was running the program, I got emails from people saying, it was so much fun to write a proposal about what I really want to do as opposed to what I think I could get funded to do, that even if I didn't get the money, it was still good to be given the license to think the way I really should think.
Jeremy, reproducibility is a hallmark of good science. There's a rising concern that big science is facing a replication crisis. What does the data tell us?
Well, I think there have been studies that have been done looking at trying to reproduce important and interesting studies, and the results have been very concerning. That is, attempts to reproduce the results haven't been successful in many of the cases, certainly not all, but in a number of cases. I think it's important now to really, put on our hat as diagnosticians and really understand why that's true. There's I think a very small fraction of it which is due to, misconduct and really the most worrisome sorts of things, fraud and so on. I think many of the problems come from not being able to describe adequately what exactly you did and being able to get all the experimental conditions really right so that you're really redoing the same experiments that were done. Mm-hmm. Some of them are due to lack of robustness. That is, experiments work, but there are lots of factors that aren't really very well controlled so that the experiment doesn't always work the same way, even the original lab that was doing it.
On that issue, what role could integrated laboratory automation and cloud labs play in improving reproducibility? I'm surprised to see hand pipettes and egg timers still being used in some labs.
Well, technology is certainly part of it, but I think a lot of it is not so much the technology of doing the experiment the same way as much as it is, slightly different batches of a commercial antibody preparation or differences in the exact mouse strain that was used if you're doing animal studies and so on. I think one of the great challenges that we're certainly struggling with at Science is how to collect and share the really highly specialized experimental details about it, how an experiment was done, so that if somebody tries to reproduce it, they have as much information as they possibly can to reproduce the experiment. The challenge is really a communication challenge. That is, you can have a very, very detailed description of an experiment, but it's so detailed that it's very hard to sort out what's important and what's not. Imagine writing a diary of your day which says, got up this morning on the left side of the bed and put on my shoes, first the right shoe and the left shoe, and so on and so forth, and going through the whole details. It would be very hard to sort through that and find out what mattered.
Well, the semiconductor industry solved this problem as it went down to nanometer feature sizes. They were very, very careful about being able to specify everything that went into the production process. Right.
No, I think there is certainly a role for, and there's some innovative ideas about how to capture the information in an efficient way. And, one example of a technology which I think is increasingly used that didn't used to be, say, 10 years ago is barcoding. That is, it's hard if you have to sit down and type, I used this bottle, which was from this lot number and so on. But if it's barcoded, you just scan it, and it's in your lab notebook in the right way, and you don't have to do it every time you use it. So there's certainly technological advances that can make this easier. But there are also other aspects of reproducibility that are being looked at. One of the things which is being done is really doing the experiment, and that is trying to reproduce particular sets of experiments in a controlled way. One of the things which is, getting back to our earlier topic about funding, is it's relatively hard to get funding to try to reproduce somebody else's results because the scientific community has
There's no glory in that.
Well, there's no glory in it because the reviewers are stuck with, 20 proposals describing potentially really exciting new ideas compared to proposals just saying, this is a result and I want to check it because it's so important and we want to make sure it's right. And it's hard unless you have a set-aside program just for replication that the system will end up picking the replication studies in the expense of not exploring new territory.
Big data technology is now available that would allow not just a few figures and some cherry-picked results to be published in scientific journals, but the entire data set behind any experiment. This would allow other scientists to spot errors or uncover reporting biases and might even be used to discover new meaning in data. If scientific work is taxpayer-funded, why can't that come along with a requirement that all the data be made publicly accessible?
Well, that's a great question. I think, again, that's something that both agencies and the scientific community and publishers are struggling with, again, is how to share data in an effective way. And there's a big difference between just sharing data and actually sharing it in a way that's useful. There's a story, I don't know whether it's true or not, that when the FDA approached the tobacco, got the authority to get data from the tobacco industry's response was sending them 1 million one-page PDFs. So that
sometimes
they
journals
complied
look like
with the rule and they shared the data, but it's not really in a form that's useful without a massive amount of work. And the same thing is true. One of the things I've been involved with at University of Pittsburgh is personalized medicine. Trying to share electronic health record data is really challenging, both because the electronic health record isn't really a vehicle for sharing details about the characteristics of the patient and their disease and so on. It's mostly for scheduling and billing. So if you're looking for even simple questions like, who is this person's physician, that's not so obvious. And then when you play this out with large, complicated experiments, putting the data out in a form that can be analyzed is very much a non-trivial problem. Very important, and I think there is progress being made, but there's a lot of work to be done to try to figure out how to do this. One of the things that I've been doing over the last couple of years is, again, reinventing myself, but I'm actually taking a certificate program through Coursera on data science, and I'm actually in the middle of my last course just to learn how to do big data analysis and what the pitfalls are. And
fascinating.
I think it's really important to do that and realize that the one lesson which I've learned, which I think every data scientist has learned, is that cleaning up the data is 95+% of the work. Actually doing the analysis is pretty easy once you have a clean data set, but getting to a clean data set is really hard.
Jeremy, speaking of the industry policing itself, I read Retraction Watch every morning, and I'm appalled that scientists who are caught in outright fabrication and fraud aren't drummed out of the service. Many of them get sentenced to a few years of supervision, and then they're right back on the public payroll. Are we being too lax with the cheaters?
Again, I think that's a very important topic and something that in my new role is something that I'm educating myself about and trying to figure out how to take appropriate steps. Science is very much dependent on trusting people's honesty and integrity, and I think the ability to find sanctions for true misconduct that's commensurate with the damage that's been done, I think is an important question. My personal view at this point is that I share your sense that the sanctions might not be harsh enough, and the publicity around the violations that occur, I think it's still a little bit under what it needs to be. I think Retraction Watch and similar places perform a great service by shining light on misbehavior. At the same time, it's important to have due process. So there are things which come up on Retraction Watch and PubPeer where people are accused of things which turn out not to be true, that figures that look like they've been manipulated turn out to be compression artifacts from the way the figures are processed, and in fact the data are perfectly fine. So it's as with always, it's a balance between an accusation and then due process to check to find out what the reality is, and then appropriate punishments for people who really have misbehaved and violated both the taxpayers' trust if they're using taxpayers' money to do their research, but also the scientific community's trust that the integrity of science is something that I think is really important to maintain as rigorously as possible.
Well, let's get back to the issue of public trust and talk a little bit about the politicization of science and its toxic impact on public support. Are some scientists getting too involved in policy advocacy?
I think there should be a separation between science and public policy. With that said, I think many public policy issues does need to be informed by science. So I think it's the distinction between the two that's important. So as a scientist, I would say, here's an issue we've been working on and investigating, and here are the scientific results. Here's what we know. Here's what we believe and can support to some degree. Here are the things that we're uncertain about. And then that transitions into a policy discussion of, okay, if we think this is true, then as policymakers, what do we do about it? And policy has aspects to it that's completely independent of the science. That is, it may be scientifically true that this is happening, but as a policy perspective, the benefits of the policy might not be worth the cost. Let me give you one example of something that I was involved in when I was at NIH, and that is working with investigators around the country to develop computer models about how infectious diseases spread through communities. So the idea was to develop relatively sophisticated models, so-called agent-based models. So they're individual people, computer people that are potentially getting sick, but also going to work and going to school and coming in contact with other people and so on. And then the question is, if there is, at the time, the big issue was avian flu in Asia, if cases appear in North America, how will it spread across the United States? And once that's been looked in sort of the baseline, is suppose you institute policies such as closing airports or closing schools or directed vaccination programs, what sort of impact would they have and how do the costs weigh against the potential benefits? So one good example was the airport closure. If you remember back, this was back in 2004 through 2006. There was a lot of discussion about closing airports, and what the modeling showed very compellingly was by the time you detected cases in Canada, closing the airports in the U.S. would have
too late.
Essentially no benefit, that you might postpone the epidemic by a day. On the other hand, suppose it had turned out the other way. Suppose the modeling had showed that that would be a potentially effective strategy. Just because that's what the science shows, that doesn't mean that the policymakers automatically say, okay, we're going to do it. They have to weigh the benefits of closing airports and decreasing the number of cases in the U.S. versus the costs of the logistical costs of closing airports and the economic consequences of closing airports, and then sort of what if scenarios. If you close airports, are people going to find other ways to travel to the U.S.? So that it may look like it works in the model, but wouldn't actually work in reality.
Speaking of models, some politicians have launched efforts to criminalize scientific debate, claiming that once a theory like cataclysmic anthropogenic global warming becomes settled science, skeptics need to be shut down. What do you make of that?
I think it's been very important to maintain appropriate channels for questioning in good faith, quote, settled science. I don't even know what settled science really is. But as I said from at the beginning, here's what we know, data that's really pretty solid. Here's what we believe, but every scientific bit of information has an associated uncertainty. Sometimes the uncertainty is very, very low. Sometimes it's much higher. And trying to balance that with continued open investigation, I think, is very important. On the other hand, with regard to policy, at some point you have to say, and policymakers, I think this is their biggest challenge, is they're dealing with lots of uncertainty. There are very few things that they really know super solidly, and yet they have to make decisions that have a potentially very important consequential decisions for society. So they have to weigh the information that they have available, question it to the best that they can, but then eventually say, we have to close airports, for example, if that had turned out to be a good policy decision.
Jeremy, when I was growing up, there was a company whose slogan was something like better living through science. Is that still true?
Absolutely. Actually, as a chemist, I think it was better living through chemistry.
Right, as a DuPont.
Yeah, exactly. But no, that's the importance, certainly I feel about science and scientific research, is that science is really a method. That is, it's a way to collect data, propose a hypothesis based on those data, critically test it, do your best to try to prove that you're wrong, and then move forward. What's been proven over time is that because of the robustness that comes from the scientific method and the fact that, in the ideal case anyway, it's relatively free from politics and other sorts of biases, that it's robust information that can be used to develop products and services that make society better, that improve the human condition, that make our lives easier and more productive and economically more effective and so on. So I think the opportunities for science to contribute to society in a very, very positive way, both in terms of better health and better living in lots of ways, and also economic development, I think, are tremendous. So I can't imagine a more exciting time for science to continue to contribute to some of the really pretty daunting problems that we do face at this point.
Well, Jeremy, thanks so much for coming on with us and sharing your perspective, and good luck with your new challenges at Science.
Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure.
That was Jeremy Berg, editor-in-chief of the Science Journals, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. To make sure you don't miss any of our shows, stop by realclearradio.org and sign up for updates. Today's program was partially underwritten by the generous support of Donors Trust, the donor advised fund committed to promoting a free society. For more information, visit donorstrust.org. The head, Daniel Sarowitz, co-director of the Consortium for Science Policy and Outcomes, deconstructs the world of big science and offers advice on how to save it from itself. Stay tuned.